Chapter 4 of Home Part 2. The tower that stood guard above the Hall of Relics loomed before her, and she slipped through the door and back into the darkness with a sigh of relief. Twilight lit her horn, finding herself in what she recognized as a break room for guards on patrol. An empty weapon rack lined one wall, and a single, armored skeleton rested among the splinters of a broken table and a scattered deck of faded cards. Twilight grimaced as she stepped past it and made for the stairs. The tower was still mostly whole, and surprisingly so. The stones of the stairwell were spiderwebbed with a lattice of chips and cracks from which sprouted growths of purple algae that crawled over the walls like congealed blood. The growth grew thicker as she descended, and soon Twilight found the solid clopping of her hoofsteps being replaced by the soft squelching of her weight pressing down into the thick mass. She came to a wooden door, barely recognizable behind the curtain of algae that sealed it shut. She glanced backwards, meeting Midnight's judging gaze, and brought a spell to mind. It seemed like forever since she had needed to think of her weed-clearing spell, and it took her a few tries to get the shape of it right. A small smile graced her lips as the purple algae dried out, lost its color, and crumbled into a thin dust at her hooves.
Careful, little flower. This could be the first step on your murderous rampage.
Twilight snorted. She grabbed the doorknob in her magic, grunting as it resisted her. She narrowed her eyes and applied more pressure, and the door gave with the sound of something damp peeling away. Thick spirals of dust fell in its wake, and Twilight gave them a few seconds to settle before stepping through. She was in a long hallway, lined with doors on her right side and completely covered in algae. The doors would take her to curtained booths overlooking the hall, but they were all sealed shut by thick layers of the growth. Twilight felt a wet, wriggling motion around her hooves, and she bit back a startled yelp as she danced backwards, putting more power into her light. She watched, open-mouthed, as the mat of algae slithered forward, reclaiming the ground around the open door.
What is this?
Twilight asked, taking a calming breath. The algae reached the door, extending tiny tendrils up to grab at it and snail up its surface.
I've never seen anything like it.
Midnight placed a chilling hoof under her chin, pushing Twilight's gaze towards the end of the hall.
Perhaps there is the source.
Twilight frowned. Dispelling her light, she confirmed that there was a purple glow blooming up from what she knew to be the curving staircase that would take her down to the floor of the Hall of Relics. She shot a glare towards Midnight.
Is that you?
Midnight chuckled, letting out a mirthful sigh.
Surely by now you can tell when I'm touching our magic. No, that glow comes from neither of us.
Twilight held the glare a second longer, but she knew it was right. She turned back to the strange light, watching it strengthen and fade, almost like some fey heartbeat, and sent a series of pings in its direction. They returned to her, distorted, a jumbled mess of meaningless magic, and some didn't return to her at all. Twilight grimaced. She shivered at the almost imperceptible sound of the algae growing further up the door behind her.
What do you think we should do? Looking for my input now?
Midnight asked, feigning surprise.
Need you even ask? We press onwards. Or would you let a stray firefly keep you from our goals? It could be dangerous. Fret not, little flower. I shall protect us, whether you like it or not.
Midnight took a few steps ahead of her, looking back expectantly.
Now are you done quailing at strange lights? Or must I drag you to victory myself?
With a low growl, Twilight pushed her stiff limbs into motion. The algae writhed in complaint under her hoof, and she could hear the quiet, slick whispering as it grew over the little scuffs and scrapes she left with every step. A pungent, sickeningly sweet scent drifted into her nostrils, and she had to pause to hold a hoof up to her mouth and hold down bile. She cast a simple spell to dampen her sense of smell, frowning at the unexpected difficulty, and carried on. Magic was hanging heavy in the air, thick enough that it was smothering any attempt she made to cast it herself. A low humming became apparent as she reached to the top of the stairwell, throbbing in time with the light. Cautiously, Twilight poked her head around the corner and squinted into the light. For a moment, Twilight thought the Hall of Relics had somehow come to life. What was once a vast open space of pristine tile and stone was now clogged with tall stalks of rotten wood and writhing vines. She knew the hall consisted of 7 vaults, 3 on each side holding powerful relics of magic history, and the one on the end containing the elements of harmony. But they were impossible to see past the dead forest before her. Only one vault was still visible. The massive stones of its walls cracked and collapsed, the source of the brilliant, pale purple glow that filtered through the trees. She didn't need carefully trained arcane senses to pinpoint it as the source of the ambient magic. Twilight watched with wide eyes as thick, thorny vines crept out from the compromised vault, the fibrous flesh a pale, translucent white that seemed to catch the purple glow and channel it as a vein carries blood. The veins dropped down beneath the exposed roots of the trees and spread out across the floor of the hall, visible among the shadows only due to the arcane light they carried.
This is impossible,
Twilight whispered. She could see the trees growing, the pale white saplings pushing through the blanket of detritus, hardening into flanky chunks of wood, and then growing still. The groan of cracking wood filled the room as one of the dead spires began to topple, the weak wood shattering to splinters as it collided with its closest neighbors.
How does all this grow without any sunlight or nutrients? In a place like this, possible takes on strange meaning,
Midnight said.
Let us fetch our trinkets and be gone from here. This magic grates against me.
Twilight looked to Midnight curiously, cocking her head at the strained expression on its face.
Are you okay?
Midnight bared its fangs at her, but failed to hide its discomfort.
You would regret insulting me further. Return to the Mathered Hoof.
Rolling her eyes at the petulant behavior, Twilight turned her attention back to the hall, her eyes scanning every corner in search of danger. The purple glow of the pale vine stretched out across the room, but drew up just short of the stairways that flanked the main entrance. She watched, mesmerized as the glowing tendrils slowly danced side to side, arcing out into new directions before fading away like the echo of lightning. She would have liked to grab a notebook and perch herself there for hours, studying their motions, but Midnight's impatience picked at her hooves, a palpable force urging her into motion. She came fully around the stairs, descending to the level of the roots, and tested one with a hoof. It crumbled to pieces, staining her fur with its damp remains. Twilight went to gather her magic, angling herself towards the back of the room for a teleport, but the oppressive aura of the room denied her. Frowning, she eyed the roots nearest her. Some appeared younger, firmer, and there were places where several overlapped into a gnarled, nearly solid mass. If she was careful, it might be enough to hold her weight. She raised a hoof, tentatively placing it on the nearest such spot, and pressed down. The wood was spongy and soft, but it pushed back instead of falling away. She added another hoof, and then a third. As she raised her last leg off the stone of the stairs, her full weight came to bear, and she screamed as the wood cracked, plunging her into the depths below. Twilight was drowning. Her whole body was held in place by the wet grip of the changeling pod. She sucked in a breath of air, desperate to fill her lungs before her hooves hit solid ground. The glowing vines crawled along the floor around her, silhouetting the network of roots above. A layer of damp refuse clung to her fur all the way up to her knees, but she was safe. Behind her, she heard Midnight's laughter. Her cheeks grew hot, and she rounded on her doppelganger with a righteous fury even as violent shivers racked her body.
Shut up! I could have died!
Midnight smirked back at her.
And yet we remain alive! A thrill, isn't it?
Twilight clenched her jaw to keep her teeth from clattering. She turned away from her laughing shadow with a frustrated groan, hoping to be back on solid stone as soon as possible, and began to slosh forwards. The muck fought back, tugging at her hooves with such force that she was only barely able to catch herself from toppling forwards and splashing face first through the silvery sheen of its surface. With a grunt of exertion, she threw her weight forwards, tearing a hoof free with a wet pop.
Oh, a step. Only a few dozen more and we might get somewhere. I'm not enjoying this any more than you are.
The ground was treacherous, and as much of an ordeal as it was to raise her legs, Twilight then had to deal with finding something solid to stand on without being able to see. She grimaced as she put her weight onto what she had taken for a small rock, only to have it crumble under a hoof. She hated that she was able to recognize the sensation of crushing a skull beneath her, and hated that she was able to keep going so easily. She kept an eye on the writhing vines, doing her best to avoid them, but her progress was slow, and the glowing tendrils sometimes grew faster toward her than she could get out of the way. They would wrap around her legs with what Twilight imagined to be curiosity, their feeble grip barely noticeable compared to the strength of the tar. The energy channeled through them was enough to make her vision blur and make Midnight hiss with annoyance, but she would power through, setting her jaw and plowing forwards until her sight cleared once more. She didn't know how long it took to reach the back of the hall, but at last Twilight emerged from the roots and looked up to see the towering doors of the Vault of the Elements. The golden designs engraved into the enchanted metal barely visible behind a splotchy layer of purple algae and the brittle gray vines that crawled up its sides even in death. Twilight took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment's respite after the grueling journey across the hall.
Now what?
Midnight asked. It stood beside her, regarding the door with idle curiosity.
The door's enchanted to only open to Princess Celestia's touch,
Twilight said.
But after so long, after who knows what's happened, I might be able to find a way through.
It was a long shot, for sure. The princess's magic had always been far beyond her own, and she could barely even feel anything past a thick arcane fog that filled the room. She lifted a black-coated hoof and went to press it to where she knew the horn-shaped keyhole should be, only for it to pass through the layer of algae without any resistance. She frowned.
Huh?
She swept her hoof across the door, peeling the algae away and revealing open space where the keyhole should be. She brought her other hoof up, scratching at the door in earnest as her pulse quickened.
Oh no! Oh no, 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 no!
As she exposed more and more of the door, she began to make out details. A wide hole, about as wide as she was and 3 times as tall, had been made through the center. The metal drooped and sagged around its edges as if it had been melted, leaving the elements exposed to the world at large. Twilight strained against the muck, pulling herself up through the hole and entering the vault. A stone pedestal waited in the center of the room, where there should have been a golden box containing the most powerful magic known to pony kind. There was only empty space. Twilight's legs went weak, and she collapsed back against the half-melted vault door.
The elements!
Midnight stepped past her, examining the empty pedestal with disdain.
As if we needed them anyways. Let us leave this place. No!
Twilight shook herself and climbed back to her hooves. She gnashed her teeth, shutting her eyes and drawing on her magic. It resisted her, the magic only just trickling past the thickness that hung around her, but she refused to give in.
Help me!
Even with her eyes closed, she could clearly see Midnight arching a brow.
So demanding. Where is the meek little flower I've come to know?
Twilight forced the words out through clenched teeth.
I don't have the energy to spare on your games right now. Please just help. Well, since you've asked so nicely.
The darkness surged inside her, and Twilight gasped in pain as she finally forced the magic past the barrier surrounding her. Her horn burst into light, allowing her to see even the farthest corners of the raided vault. Squinting through the pane, Twilight saw a second hole in the room, this one bored high up on the far wall. The pane spiked as she poured more power into her horn, focusing her light into a powerful beam that aimed straight through the hole. A path had been melted straight through the back of the room and out into the stuffy air of Canterlot, framing the top of a nearby tower that Twilight immediately recognized. It was the old tower she had stayed in before moving to Ponyville. Twilight released her magic, gasping as the sharp pain turned into a pulsing ache just behind the base of her horn. She fell to her haunches, breathing hard. She looked up to see Midnight crouching in front of her, its head cocked to the side.
I suppose you want to go there next.
Twilight managed a shaky nod.
Whoever took the elements, they must have taken them to my old tower. So it would seem.
Midnight extended a hoof, and Twilight took it, straightening back up with its help. Its fanged smile didn't reach its eyes.
I'm ready to help, if you require it.
Twilight huffed as she turned back to the Hall of Relics and the rotten forest.
I'll be sure to keep that in mind.
Rainbow followed Applejack into the submarine, reached an armored hoof, and closed the hatch behind her. The sound rang through the hall with a sense of finality as she climbed down the ladder and put all 4 hooves on the gently rocking floor beneath. She raised her voice, turning towards the cockpit.
Hatch shut!
Star Trio shouted back.
Clamps off!
The hull lurched from side to side, and Rainbow lowered her stance to keep her poise. Sea Saber's powerful voice carried easily as she yelled, "Engines!" There was a burst of steam, and slow ticking sounds began to fill the air. They sped up, overlapping into the same staccato hum to which Rainbow had grown used to falling asleep during the past weeks. The drone of the hull served to calm her nerves as the floor shifted beneath her. They had begun their dive to Canterlot. Flint stepped in from the little hatch that led to the bridge. Sometimes Rainbow wondered how he even fit. He beckoned towards Applejack as he squeezed past towards the torpedo room. "Give me a hoof, will you, Jackie?" "Sure thing, Flint." Applejack gave Rainbow a smile and nod before following the larger stallion to the rear of the sub. Rainbow offered up a weak smile of her own, watching them go before wordlessly turning the opposite direction.
Jackie?
When had Flynn started calling her that? She had no knowledge concerning the workings of the submarine, and she wasn't particularly looking for a task to busy herself with anyways. So she made for the front compartment, the relatively open space between the control room and the airlock, where supplies and equipment could be stored. Closets and cabinets competed for wall space with dials and machinery, the rattling of their contents sometimes interrupted by the sound of venting steam. A pair of thin cloth beds were folded up against the walls, and for a moment Rainbow considered pulling one out to sit on, but decided against it. She had spent a lot of time in her dive suit in the past few days, and she'd since learned that everything from beds to rocks to trees felt just as hard when her flanks were covered in metal. On the bright side, the custom suits came with a layer of cushioning that kept the discomfort to a minimum as she settled into a corner to wait. How long had it been since she had had a moment like this? Just herself and her thoughts, and the time to indulge them. Most of her time in this future had been defined by a sense of helplessness, and the agitation it spawned when she was made to sit and watch while her friends risked their lives to discover what happened to their world. She didn't bother trying to hide her grimace as she thought of all the times she had paced back and forth in the sub, as she listened to Twilight nearly dying at the bottom of the ocean, or being unable to help when monsters threatened the submarine itself. She remembered the emptiness she had felt as Gava had carried her around like a sack of hay. The wooden planks of the Griffin ship were still clear in her mind, the image muddied only by the blurry redness that had clogged her vision back then. She lifted a hoof and tugged at her mane, pulling her rainbow bangs to hang over her eye patch. Or she hoped they did at least. It was difficult to tell without a mirror. She had been so angry since then. But as she felt the sub dive ever deeper towards the ruins where she hoped to find her lost friend, all she felt was an uneasy trepidation. Her days had been filled with rigorous training ever since the meeting with Crazy Rich, and even at night she was called to assist with the preparations for the second expedition to Canterlot. What little time she had had to herself was spent eating the custom-ordered meals cooked by the estate chefs before she passed out into deep, dreamless sleep, only to be roused the next dawn by Sea Saber and marched out to do it all over again. They had practiced with their dive suits on, submerged in Crazy's private pools. They had run dozens of laps around his gardens, both armored and not. At the end of each training session, when Rainbow's whole body ached and she struggled to keep her thoughts together, Saber had confronted her with new challenges. Rainbow shrugged her shoulders as she felt the bruises sustained when she was made to fight an armored flintlock with her wings bound to her sides. He had really seemed to enjoy himself that day. Sometimes she had wondered whether it was punishment for getting Crazy to send Saber's team back into the ruins where they had nearly died, but she didn't dare ask. Maybe it really was just Saber preparing her for the dive, as she'd said. It seemed unlike the stern Pegasus to hold a grudge like that, but then Rainbow had only known her for a few weeks. Now, at last, Rainbow was free to think, and even with the mental exhaustion she'd accumulated, she couldn't bring herself to relax. If it came to it, could she take Twilight down? It wasn't a question of ability, she was Rainbow Dash after all, but of heart. Was it more loyal to end a friend who had lost herself to the corruption that had taken Equestria, or to let oneself be struck down trying to redeem her? There was a part of Rainbow that hoped she would never find Twilight, that she'd never have to confront the question. Her wings twitched within their armored shells, and she wondered how much longer it would be. She looked up as Applejack stepped into the compartment. The cow pony cocked her head. "Feeling all right, Artie?" Rainbow snorted, forcing a grin.
Of course. Why? You nervous?
Applejack sat down next to her with a concerned frown.
Rainbow, y'all know I can tell when there's something bothering you, right?
Rainbow rolled her eye and looked away.
I'm fine, AJ, just a little tired is all. Mm-hmm.
Seconds passed, and Applejack said nothing. Rainbow kept her gaze on the opposite wall, knowing that the truth would be out if she met her friend's eyes, and tried to look bored. She pursed her lips as she felt a feather out of place, and she realized she wouldn't be able to fix it until she got out of her suit. After just a few minutes, she could already feel her defenses cracking. Applejack cleared her throat, as if to say something, but Rainbow couldn't hold herself back anymore.
Do you think we'll have to kill Twilight?
After a few seconds, Applejack spoke. Her voice was soft.
Now, why would you be thinking some wild things like that, Sugar Cube? Twilight had to kill Aloysius,
Rainbow said, still looking away.
Philomena, too. Spike tried to kill us. It just seems like, you know.
She bit her lip.
Like there's only one way out.
Applejack sighed, leaning over to comfort Rainbow with her weight.
Rainbow, Twilight's a clever filly. She wouldn't let something like that happen. She wouldn't let it, no.
Rainbow's voice cracked as she leaned into her friend.
But what if she doesn't get a choice?
Silence. Hesitantly, Rainbow turned to face Applejack and saw that she wasn't the only one with redness in her eyes. Applejack gave a small, lopsided smile.
She's always got a choice.
Rainbow sniffled, giving a little nod.
Yeah. Hey, you guys ready?
Rainbow jumped, her heart skipping a beat as Star Trail's voice suddenly came from her blind side. She turned sharply to face the unicorn.
What? Oh, hey, my bad.
Trails offered an apologetic smile before continuing.
Helmet's on in 10. We've reached the tunnel.
Rainbow stood up, meeting Applejack's gaze with a deep breath.
We'll be ready. Right on,
Trails said. Her hooves clanged against the floor as she stepped out of the room. Rainbow held out a hoof, and Applejack took it. The two mares shared a clunky hug.
We are coming, Twilight.